Deep dive into the as-is contract. So let us start on page 1. I'm going to be referring to the lines on the far left. So line 1 is where it says parties and so on and so forth. It's very important that when you're putting the seller in, you don't put of record. You actually do the research on IMAP or MLS and put in the seller's name. And for the buyer's name also. Property description, self-explanatory. The legal description is very important. The legal description is more important than the address. So you want to make sure that you're copying over the entire legal description. Sometimes a property will have more than one lot, and so the legal description is what tells the title company that they're appropriating the right lot during a sale. There is a possibility that if the legal description is incorrect and the title work is incorrect and the sale is incorrect, and I have known of cases where a property was supposed to come with 2 lots, MLS says both lots are included, but the agent never put the legal description correctly, and so title company wasn't aware of the second lot and never conveyed. And after the fact, seller's like, well, we changed our mind, we're not selling the second lot anymore. And there was nothing that they could do about it. So that is very important. The next section is we're talking about fixtures. A fixture is something that is attached to the wall in a semi-permanent basis, including built-in appliances, built-in furnishings. And so if you have a property that has an office, and the office has built-in cabinetry and built-in desk, that is a fixture that stays with the house. A TV is not a fixture because a TV can be easily removed, even if it's hung on the wall. However, the mount for the television is a fixture because the fixture is what's attached to the wall. The TV is attached to the mount. So under personal property, you will see that there was new language that was added in the last couple years that specifically mentions that drapes, blinds, window treatments, and television wall mounts and hardware are all expected to convey. So unless excluded in line 24, everything is included. So there's no need for you to write in refrigerator on line 21. That will drive me crazy. If there are, here's a question. Let's say there's a fridge in the garage, and there's a fridge in the kitchen, and there's a wine fridge. Which of them convey automatically in the contract? Because it says refrigerator / S, parentheses S. So that means if there are 3 refrigerators on the property, all 3 fridges convey. Nest thermostat stays. They cannot take their Nest thermostat unless they have excluded it from the contract. Even if it's in the MLS that the refrigerator doesn't convey, if it's on the contract supersedes MLS. So you want to make sure that the contract matches the MLS, especially if you're the listing agent. So if you're the listing agent and you've put in the MLS that the fridge in the kitchen doesn't convey, and it's not specifically excluded in line 24, 25, then you're out of luck. You have sold that person's refrigerator. Okay, we go to purchase price. That's self-explanatory. We go to escrow. That is self-explanatory. Let's talk about timelines. On all the timelines that you see here, where it says on line 30, if left blank, then 3 days, you want to fill in the time, always. You don't want to leave anything blank. Because what will happen is someone that is not as ethical as we are could slip in a different number in there, and it's hard to tell when that number, that it's been agreed to or not agreed to. So you never want to leave anything blank. 3 days is good. Let's talk about days. 3 days is 3 calendar days. 3 calendar days. If a day falls on a weekend, so if escrow, inspection, closing, loan commitment fall on a weekend, it automatically gets extended to the next business day the time expires at 11:59 p.m. on the day. So, for example, you go under contract on Monday. You have 3 days to deliver escrow. Monday is, so Tuesday's day 1, Wednesday's day 2, Thursday's day 3, so you have until 11:59 p.m. to submit escrow. Now, technically, you can't submit escrow after 5 because that's when title companies close. But that's when the burden would be for inspection. So if the inspection period ends on Thursday, you have until 11:59 p.m. on Thursday to either have everything fully agreed to in writing or to submit a cancellation. We'll get to more on that in a second. For escrow agent, you want to put name, address, email, phone number, everything you have. Fax, don't worry about fax. I can't remember the last time anything was faxed. Line 36, sometimes on a cash deal, you'll have 2 deposits. One deposit that's entered up front, another deposit that's entered after inspections. So that is where that would be used for. That's why it usually says 10 days after effective date. Next is financing. I would prefer that you had expressed financing as a percentage instead of a dollar amount. And then E is the balance to close, not including buyer's closing costs, prepaids, and prorations. And so what that means is that is purchase price minus deposit minus what they're financing equals balance to close. Okay, next, time for acceptance. You want to fill that in. Time for acceptance, you want to make it as short as possible if you're on the buying side. You want to see something as long as possible if you're on the listing side. And again, it is time period. You can indicate a certain day at a certain time. If you indicate just the day, it means, so if you indicate that the time for acceptance is 4/8, it's assumed that 4/8 is going to be that 11:59 that day. 11:59 that day. Time for acceptance doesn't roll over to a business day. So time for acceptance is one of the few time periods that can expire on a weekend. All right, very important. Very, very, very important. This is going to be one of the key points from today's lesson. What is the effective date? It's both parties have signed and both parties have been delivered the final copy of the contract. So your buyer signs at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The seller signs at 7 o'clock in the afternoon, but as the buyer's agent, you don't receive a copy of the executed contract until the next morning. The next morning is the effective date. So, and this language is reiterated in line 48-49. Effective date is when the last one of the buyer and seller has signed and initialed and delivered this offer. Okay, next, closing date is pretty standard. You want to make sure that the closing date actually falls on a weekday. It is our preference that you do not put closing dates for Fridays, nor do you put the closing date for the last day of the month, if you can help it. Now, obviously, if the buyer, seller, if that's what their preference is, but if you can steer them to close on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, that is ideal. Extension of the closing date. The buyer has to receive the loan disclosure, the closing disclosure, the CD, 3 days prior to closing. If they don't receive the closing disclosure 3 days prior to closing, the closing date gets automatically extended until the 3rd day. So if the buyer hasn't received, and this is something that is getting kind of ignored and waived, but this is something you should understand when you have a buyer, what their rights are. So if the buyer doesn't receive a copy of the CD until the day before closing, then you don't have to close the next day. Now, what banks are doing to get around this is they're giving a BS initial CD early on in the process. And as long as the numbers don't go up from the initial CD, they have met their requirement. So for example, 2 weeks before closing, they get the initial CD. The initial CD is super inflated with the fees, super inflated with the amounts. that the lender has satisfied their obligation, so you don't have to worry about it. Because the spirit of the law is for the buyer to not be surprised negatively a couple days before closing, like, oh shit, I need to bring $12,000 to the table. I thought it was only $5,000. It's much different if they're like, oh, I only need to bring $5,000. I thought I had to bring 12. That's no one gets upset about that. Okay, moving on. Force majeure is for us hurricanes, floods. It's any kind of force majeure is act of God. So any act of God that would prevent a closing from happening. So if the power goes out and there's no power utility service at the closing agent and nothing can be accommodated otherwise, then closing gets pushed. It's an act of God out of our control. Occupancy and possession. So on the day of closing, this is something that I have happened a lot. Seller doesn't think they have to move out until after closing. So you have to let them know that when closing happens, everything should be out, everything should be clear. The standard for property is broom swept. It doesn't have to be clean. It doesn't have to be professionally clean. It doesn't have to have, it just has to be broom swept. If a property is subject to lease or occupancy after closing, then 72B must be checked. And a copy of the lease agreement or occupancy must be included. So examples, a lot of common examples last year were post-occupancies by the seller. So seller would close and then agree to stay in the home for 30 days after closing. If that is going to happen, then B must be checked. If there's an investment property where there's a lease in place, then B must be checked. And then in here, there is a separate due diligence period that states that if the buyer determines in the buyer's sole discretion that the lease or the terms of occupancy are not acceptable to the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice and shall be refunded their full deposit. So buyer in the buyer's sole discretion. So even if everything is as advertised, even if everything is exactly as it was, if there's nothing wrong, the buyer can decide in their sole discretion that they're uncomfortable with and they can back out within the first 5 days. Next is assignability. So assigning is talking about liability, assigning liability on the contract. So if you are the listing agent, you always want to see the third box checked. You don't ever want to leave them blank. And that is may not assign this contract. So assignability means that they are basically passing the contract to somebody else. There are some situations where celebrities will buy a property using a holding company and then they'll assign the contract to themselves at a later date to kind of keep the secrecy confidentiality. There are wholesalers that will buy property, they'll put property under contract and then they'll try to get someone else to buy it from them before the closing happens, and then they assign the contract to somebody else. If the first box is checked or the second box is checked, then the buyer can assign the contract to whomever they want and the seller can't do anything about it. Financing, A is cash, B is contingent upon financing. Now, so I'm a buyer and I'm getting a mortgage, I can write a contract that says it's a cash transaction with no financing contingency. Because basically what I'm doing is I'm eliminating all of my protection. So I'm saying that I'm so sure that I'm qualified for this property that I am going to waive my financing contingency protections and waive my appraisal protections. Right. Basically what you're saying is the money is going to be there at the closing day. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about how it gets there. Mm-hmm. I'm not worried about how it gets there. I don't want you to worry about how it gets there. It's going to be there. So you're basically waiving all of your things. So this is saying that it's treated as a cash transaction with no financing contingency. What you should do in this situation is add an appraisal contingency to the contract. So you are waiving their financing contingency, which means the ability to get the loan, but you're keeping in the valuation protection of an appraisal. And you can do that with a regular cash offer with no financing as well. So again, you're going to fill in the dates. So you want to give your buyer enough time to get approval. So 30 days minimum. I like to see 35 here. You want to check conventional FHA, VA. Other example of other would be a USDA loan or a private mortgage or a hard money loan. That would be other. Okay, next thing is the appraisal is rolled into this time period. So the appraisal must be completed and returned and approved as satisfactory or non-satisfactory during this timeline. If let's say we have a 30-day time period, and on day when the appraisal was scheduled late, the appraiser's behind, and the appraisal comes in on day 31 and it comes in low, nothing you can do about it. You have, by not canceling or extending your loan commitment period, what you are effectively saying is you are okay with whatever happens next. You are okay to move forward. So that's why it's very important for you to stay on top of these timelines. Everyone pays attention to inspection period, everyone pays attention to closing date. I urge you to pay attention to loan commitment date, because after the loan commitment date, you must be going to closing. You'll have no other protection. So that's line 120 is what it says. Line 120, if buyer fails to timely deliver written notice to the seller prior to the expiration of the loan approval period, then the buyer shall proceed forward with this contract as though everything was fine. Closing costs. Closing costs listed here are the customary closing costs paid by the seller, paid by the buyer. In Florida, it's customary for the seller to pay the owner's title policy. If there is a loan involved in the process, there's always two title policies. One is the lender's title policy and one is the owner's title policy. The buyer is responsible for paying for the lender's title policy. The seller is responsible for paying for the owner's title policy. The lender's title policy only protects the lender, doesn't protect the buyer at all. And so, if a seller asks you, if the buyer asks you, I thought that the seller pays title, you need to make sure that you understand that the seller pays the owner's title policy, but the buyer is responsible for paying for the lender's title policy. Title insurance and evidence. So the title's going to run a lien search. They're going to run permit. They may run a permit search. You can close with open or expired permits. Open expired permits are not blemishes they're not clouds on the title that would prevent a closing. If we can skip forward a little bit, let's go to page 4. Seller, so line 168, seller designates closing agent and therefore pays for the owner's title policy and charges. And like I said, buyer pays for lender's policy. And then line 172 is buyer shall designate a closing agent. Now, there are situations where the buyer will want to choose the title company. And that would be if they're doing a simultaneous close. Let's say the buyer is closing on their property in the morning and then they're closing on the new property in the afternoon. It's very advantageous to have those closings take place at the same title company, because then there's no need to wire money a second time somewhere else. So if a wire arrives in the morning, then it's there to close in the afternoon. And so that is a way to do a simultaneous close or a same-day close. If you are doing a same-day close where they're closing on one property in the morning and the other property in the afternoon, that is incredibly stressful to do at two different title companies. And so please keep that in mind when you're putting this together. All right, so moving on. So one thing that I want you to note is that in the left column where it says all the line numbers, you'll see an asterisk is next to some of them. That means that something on that line needs to be filled out. So you want to make sure that you're going through and filling out everything. Home warranty, we know about home warranties. It's okay that you put NA on the beginning of the contract. You can always add a home warranty later. If you know up front that the buyer wants it or that the seller is offering it, definitely put it in, but this is something that can be done after the fact. Line 188 has to do with special assessments. Special assessments are public bodies and municipalities. They are not condo or homeowners associations. So, for example, The city puts in a bunch of new street lights. They put a special assessment on your taxes for the new street lights. That is what is being addressed here. In most cases, the seller will pay installments before closing and the buyer will pick up installments after closing. Sometimes, if it's a really hefty one-time expense, you want to have the seller pay it in full before closing. If the property was built before 1978, then automatically you should be looking for a lead-based paint disclosure. We'll move on to inspection because I want to spend some time here. The as-is contract, section 12, line 260. Fill in this date. Don't leave it blank. You go under contract. The buyer, in their sole discretion, can cancel the contract at any time for any reason, even if they have done no inspections, even if they have done inspections and there are no issues. There's no reason they have to give. There's no justification. You don't owe anyone a copy of the inspection report. I've had people that told me that they can't release me unless I give them a copy of the inspection report. They try to hold it hostage. None of that is true. And by the end of the inspection period, you have to have one of two things. You need to have a signed addendum that's acceptable to the buyer and seller with, credits or whatever, or repairs, or you have to have submitted a cancellation. It doesn't have to be signed, but you have to submit it. So if you are negotiating something and the negotiations are taking long and you're about to end your inspection period, you have to send the cancellation at 11:50 at night just to protect your buyer. And in the body of the email say, hey, I know we're working on something, but our inspection period is about to end, and if we don't have a deal, then we're letting you know now that our intention is to cancel. The inspection period is also when you want to get your insurance bound. There's no insurance protection here. The only insurance protection you have in the contract is force majeure. So if you are closing and there's a hurricane that has entered there's a rectangle around Florida and the Caribbean that the insurance companies use. And if there's a named storm in the rectangle, they cannot bind insurance and you can't close without bound insurance. And so if you know there's a storm that's brewing in the Caribbean, you want to get insurance bound as soon as possible because then you can still close. Even if there's a hurricane in the triangle at closing, in the rectangle at closing, you want to bind. So these are dates and time periods to pay attention to. If the property can't get insurance because of a 4-point inspection issue and you don't learn about this until after the end of the inspection period, then the buyer's out of luck. It's at that point it's the buyer's responsibility to do whatever needs to be done to get insurance bound. And so there can be a situation where you're ready to go, the appraisal's good, the loan's good, but we have no insurance. Yeah. We'll talk about walkthrough real quick. Walkthrough is very important. Everyone should be doing walkthroughs. It should happen. It doesn't have to happen the day of inspection. It can happen the day prior. This is a contractual obligation. The seller must allow you access either the day before or the day of closing to do a walkthrough. You can do a walkthrough for the buyer if they're okay with it. And the purpose of this is just to make sure the property is in the same condition it was in from inspection. And this is not a time to bring up anything new. So, if unless you can prove that something happened between then and the inspection, then you're just making sure it's all in good shape. Utilities must be on for the walkthrough. And so it is a maintenance requirement in the contract that the seller continue to pay for utilities, the seller continue to have the lawn mowed, the seller continue to have the pool. So if you get there and the lawn is a foot high and it wasn't a foot high, then the seller has not met their contractual maintenance requirement, and the seller must come up with a solution to have the lawn mowed. And if the power is not on to the house, you cannot do an effective walkthrough because there's no way for you to test anything. And so the seller must turn the power on for the walkthrough. So you could essentially delay closing because the seller is in default of their maintenance requirement. and they haven't allowed you to do it. This also states the seller is going to help and cooperate in closing out building permits. So if you identify permits have been opened, the seller is going to do whatever they need to do to help and cooperate in closing them out. This doesn't mean that the seller is going to pay for anything. It just says that the seller is not going to impede you from closing out a permit. So if someone has to come out and re-inspect a pool cage or something like that, this says that the seller will allow them access. Okay. Let's go past page 6. Let's go to let's go to page 7. Let's go to default and dispute resolution. So if someone is out of compliance with the contract, you need to inform the other party, hey, you failed to do this, you haven't done this. You also want to get us involved as your brokers so that we can be aware that there may be something in default. And then we move to dispute resolution. And so this is where we will have time this is where this buyer and seller have 10 days to argue their case and figure out a solution. We are not attorneys. If we get to the point where there's a question about the interpretation of a contract and misunderstanding the contract, at that point we're going to advise our client to retain an attorney. All we can do is, we're just messengers. We're not interpreters. We're not lawmakers. We're not lawyers, as much as I'd like to think that I'm a lawyer. We don't do that. So basically, if there's a dispute, it's like, okay, everyone, and at that point you throw your hands up, there's a dispute, you back off, and then you refer it to us, and then we kind of take over from there. Obviously, if there's small issues, we try to negotiate those. But if something is like, buyer is just not showing up at closing, okay, no worries. Thank you so much. We'll be in contact. Conveyance, closing location. So the closing should happen in the county that the property is located in. So this is where you can be a bit shrewd, because let's say that and we're a perfect example of this. Our title company is located currently in Osceola County. If you have a property in Seminole County and the other agent knows contracts, they can insist that the closing happen in Seminole County at no extra expense to their client. Luckily for us, Elevated Title will be happy to meet you somewhere and close, and they won't charge anything extra for it. At the moment, that might change. But the closing should happen in a reasonable location. You can't force a buyer to go 2 counties over to close if they don't want to. So that's something to know. That doesn't mean that the title company can't be in another county. It just means that the closing location should take place in the county where the real property is located, unless another location is agreed to by all parties. So if everyone's fine, like driving to St. Cloud to close, no sweat. Section L 508, access to property. Again, seller is obligated to allow access for appraisals, inspections, walkthroughs, and for utility service upon reasonable notice. This is where the language like reasonable notice is why attorneys get paid, is because what is reasonable notice? 5 hours? 24 hours? A week? What's reasonable? My interpretation of what's reasonable is at least 24 hours. So if you can't call someone and say, hey, the inspector's on their way, you're obligated to let them in now. This is not reasonable. But I think if you're like, hey, tomorrow morning, this person's coming by, I think that's reasonable. And so you always want to make sure that you're communicating and giving notice to the clients to do that. FIRPTA. Let's talk about FIRPTA real quick, and then we're going to wrap up. So line 553, if your seller is a foreign person and the property value, and the sales price of the property exceeds $300,000, then the buyer may be required to hold up to 15% of the amount realized by the seller for the IRS. And you ask, why isn't the seller responsible for holding it? Because the seller is not a U.S. citizen, and presumably after the seller has sold their U.S. property, they'll never be seen or heard from in the United States again. So the IRS needs to collect the blood from someone, so they choose the buyer. So this is important because you just want to make sure that the buyer is educated that FIRPTA exists. You want to make sure that the seller that you have, if they have a foreign seller, they're educated about FIRPTA. Essentially, it's the title company's responsibility to collect and withhold. That concludes our contracts training.